Jade Moreno saw the mistake 3 minutes before catastrophe. The chart trembled in her gloved hands inside Chicago's gleaming operating theater, the patient's hidden allergy burning through the page like invisible fire, while Dr. Marcus Ellery smiled that forced, dismissive curve that surgeons perfect alongside their sutures. She'd spent 4 years learning to speak medicine's language, but no one taught her how to scream through institutional deafness. The young nurse warned the surgeon. But his next move nearly killed the patient, and what she discovered in the aftermath would make her question whether saving one life was worth exposing a corruption that had already claimed dozens. Subscribe to witness the moment silence becomes complicity. To Chapter 1. The warning no one wanted. The fluorescent lights in operating room 7 hummed with the frequency of a held breath, casting everything in that particular shade of white that somehow managed to feel both sterile and suffocating at once. Jade Moreno stood at the prep station, with her hands moving through the familiar choreography of surgical preparation, arranging instruments on the tray with the precision that had become her religion during 4 years of nursing school and 2 years on the floor. The stainless steel gleamed under her gloved fingers, each tool a small promise of control in a profession where control was often an illusion. She could smell the sharp bite of antiseptic solution mixing with the subtler scent of anxiety that always permeated these rooms before the first incision, a chemical cocktail that had become more familiar to her than her own perfume. At 24, Jade had already learned that operating rooms had their own language, the hiss of ventilation systems, the rhythmic beep of monitors waiting to measure a heartbeat, the whisper of surgical gowns as bodies moved through practiced routines. This morning, something in that language felt wrong, like a sentence missing its verb, though she couldn't yet name what troubled her. The patient hadn't even been wheeled in yet, but already her instincts were firing warning signals that her conscious mind hadn't caught up to, that tingling sensation at the base of her skull that she'd learned never to ignore, even when she couldn't explain it. Dr. Marcus Ellery swept into the operating room with the kind of entrance that demanded attention without asking for it, his presence immediately reshaping the room's gravity so that everyone else became satellites orbiting his expertise. At 52, he moved with the confidence of someone who'd performed this particular surgery, laparoscopic cholecystectomy, the removal of a gallbladder gone rogue so many times that his hands could probably complete the procedure while his mind wandered to dinner plans or vacation homes. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed even beneath his surgical cap, and his eyes held that particular glint that Jade had come to recognize in senior surgeons, that mixture of competence and condescension that made them brilliant and insufferable in equal measure. He nodded tersely to the anesthesiologist, Dr. Patricia Huang, who was already reviewing her protocols with the focused intensity of someone who knew that her job was to keep people suspended in the space between consciousness and death without letting them slip too far toward either extreme. The surgical resident, a nervous third-year named Kevin Torres, stood to Ellery's left, practically vibrating with the desire to impress, his eyes darting between the surgeon and the door through which their patient would soon arrive. Jade watched this familiar dance of hierarchy and expertise, feeling, as she always did, like she was simultaneously essential and invisible. Her hands would hold instruments, her eyes would catch what others missed, but her voice existed in a frequency that senior physicians seemed genetically incapable of hearing. The patient arrived on a gurney guided by 2 orderlies whose faces Jade recognized, but whose names she'd never learned. A woman in her late 40s named Carol Westfield, whose medical history Jade had reviewed 3 times that morning because something about it had snagged in her mind like fabric on a nail. Carol's eyes were glazed with preoperative sedation, but still held that core of fear that no medication could fully erase, the primal terror of surrendering consciousness, while strangers prepared to cut into your body and rearrange your insides according to their professional judgment. Jade moved to Carol's side, placing one gloved hand on her shoulder, with the gentleness that came naturally to her. That impulse toward human comfort that nursing school had tried to temper with professional distance, but had never quite managed to extinguish. She spoke quietly to Carol, murmuring reassurances that she herself wasn't sure she believed, because that nagging sensation had intensified the moment the patient entered the room. A warning bell clanging somewhere in her subconscious that was growing louder with each passing second. Carol's chart was clipped to the end of the gurney, a thin folder of papers that contained all the bureaucratic translations of a human life. Allergies, medications, surgical history, insurance information, the reduction of a living, breathing, complicated person into data points that would guide the next 90 minutes of medical intervention. Jade's eyes kept returning to that chart, her instincts screaming that she'd missed something crucial, that somewhere in those pages was information that could mean the difference between routine and catastrophe. Dr. Ellery was scrubbing in at the sink, his back to the room, holding court with Kevin Torres about a conference he'd attended in Boston, where some new laparoscopic technique had been demonstrated, his voice carrying that tone of casual authority that came from decades of being the smartest person in most rooms he entered. Patricia Huang was checking her anesthesia equipment with meticulous care, running through mental checklists that Jade knew from observation were as complex as anything the surgeons performed, the delicate calibrations required to keep someone's body functioning while their mind took a forced vacation from consciousness. The surgical tech, an older woman named Denise Crawford, who'd been at Chicago Memorial longer than Jade had been alive, was doing her own instrument count, lips moving silently as she verified that every piece of equipment was accounted for, because the nightmare scenario of leaving something inside a patient's body cavity haunted every surgical team. Jade found herself reaching for Carol's chart again, that compulsion growing stronger, her hands moving almost of their own accord as she flipped it open and began scanning the pages with an intensity that made her vision narrow until the words became the only thing in her universe. Patient history, presenting symptoms, diagnosis, surgical plan, consent forms, all the standard documentation that she'd seen 1,000 times before. Then her eyes landed on the allergy section, and her heart performed a sickening lurch that sent adrenaline flooding through her system, because there it was, written in what looked like hurried handwriting at the bottom of the form, easily missed if you weren't looking carefully, if you were just skimming through familiar territory: severe allergy to cefazolin, the very antibiotic that was standard prophylactic protocol for this type of surgery. The medication that would normally be administered automatically unless someone specifically flagged it as contraindicated. Jade's hands began to shake, a fine tremor that she struggled to control as she read the notation again, then a third time, making absolutely certain that her exhausted brain wasn't manufacturing problems out of fatigue and stress. But no, it was there, clear as day once you actually looked at it, though it was positioned in a way that made it easy to overlook, not flagged with the usual bright stickers or prominent warnings that critical allergies typically received. Just a single line of text that could kill Carol Westfield if no one noticed it before Dr. Ellery called for the antibiotic administration that was probably already prepared and waiting. She looked up at Patricia Huang, wondering if the anesthesiologist had caught it, but Patricia was focused on her own preparations, and Jade realized with creeping horror that she might be the only person in this room who'd actually read that section of the chart carefully enough to catch the allergy notation. Her throat felt suddenly dry, her pulse hammering in her ears with a rhythm that threatened to drown out the ambient sounds of the operating room, because she understood in that moment what she was about to do The disruption she was about to cause, the challenge she was about to mount against the smooth machinery of surgical routine. Every instinct she possessed as a nurse was screaming at her to speak up, to stop this procedure before it became an emergency. But she also knew with cold certainty that speaking up meant contradicting Dr. Marcus Ellery in his own operating room, challenging his preparation in front of his resident and colleagues, potentially humiliating him if she was right, or marking herself as incompetent and paranoid if she'd somehow misread the situation. The lights seemed to intensify overhead, that white glow becoming almost accusatory as Jade made her decision, the moment stretching out like taffy until she felt suspended in amber, every possible future branching out before her in fractal patterns of consequence. She could stay quiet, trust that someone else would catch it, avoid making waves in a hospital where young nurses learned quickly that their primary value was in being helpful without being heard, in executing orders rather than questioning them. Or she could do what her training and conscience demanded, could raise her voice and insist that this surgery pause while everyone double-checked the allergy information, could risk the career she'd worked so hard to build on the chance that she was right and everyone else was wrong. Carol Westfield's sedated face swam in her vision, a woman who'd come to this hospital trusting that the system would protect her, that the hierarchy and protocols and expensive equipment all existed to keep her safe, not knowing that her life might depend on whether a 24-year-old nurse had the courage to be insubordinate. Jade felt her jaw clench, felt her spine straighten as she made a choice that she knew would define her one way or another for the rest of her career. She opened her mouth, heard her own voice cutting through the preoperative routine like a scalpel through flesh, watched as every head in the room turned toward her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to irritation. The words that came out were steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest, clear and professional and utterly uncompromising. "Dr. Ellery, we need to stop. The patient has a documented severe allergy to cefazolin, and it's not flagged in the surgical protocol." Just Chapter 2, Arrogance in the Awe. The silence that followed Jade's pronouncement felt geological, like the pause between tectonic plates grinding against each other before an earthquake reshapes the landscape. Dr. Marcus Ellery turned from the sink where he'd been scrubbing, his hands still dripping with antiseptic foam, and the expression on his face was one that Jade would later revisit in her nightmares. Not anger, exactly, but something colder and more dismissive. The look of a man who'd just been interrupted by a child during an important adult conversation. His eyebrows rose fractionally, and when he spoke, his voice carried that particular tone of strained patience that barely concealed contempt, the vocal equivalent of patting someone on the head while simultaneously pushing them aside. "I'm sorry, Nurse Moreno, but I've reviewed this patient's chart thoroughly, and I'm quite certain that all allergies have been appropriately documented and addressed in our surgical plan." And the words were technically polite, the grammar of professional courtesy, but the delivery was pure condescension. Each syllable weighted with the implication that Jade had overstepped her bounds, that she'd confused having an opinion with having expertise. Kevin Torres shifted uncomfortably beside Ellery, his eyes darting between the surgeon and Jade with the expression of someone watching a car accident in slow motion, knowing he should look away but unable to stop staring. Patricia Huang paused in her preparations, her gloved hands hovering over her equipment as she waited to see how this moment would resolve itself. Her face carefully neutral, in that way medical professionals learn to adopt when witnessing interpersonal conflict that wasn't theirs to adjudicate. Jade felt her face flush hot beneath her surgical mask, embarrassment and righteous fury mixing into a volatile compound that made her vision shimmer slightly at the edges. Every fiber of her being wanted to back down, to apologize for the interruption and let the machinery of surgery proceed, to protect herself from the professional consequences of challenging Marcus Ellery in his domain. But her eyes dropped to Carol Westfield's face, and she found her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. She held up the chart, her hands no longer shaking because anger had burned through uncertainty, leaving only clarity in its wake. With respect, Doctor, the allergy is documented here on page 4 of the admission forms, written in the section that details patient history. It's a severe reaction to cefazolin, which I believe is our standard prophylactic antibiotic for this procedure. She kept her voice level, professional, stripping out any emotion that could be used against her, presenting only facts, only information, only the truth that she could prove by pointing to the physical evidence in her hands. The chart felt simultaneously heavy and insubstantial, a flimsy collection of papers that somehow contained the power to save or destroy both Carol and Jade herself. Around them, the operating room seemed to hold its breath, the normally comfortable hum of medical equipment suddenly sounding ominous, like the ticking of a bomb that only Jade could hear. Denise Crawford, the surgical tech, moved closer to look at the chart Jade was holding, her weathered face creasing into a frown as she tried to see what Jade was pointing at, her solidarity a small comfort in a room that suddenly felt hostile. "Doctor." Ellery's expression shifted from dismissive to irritated, a muscle in his jaw tightening as he registered that Jade wasn't going to simply fold under his initial response, that she was doubling down on her interruption in a way that made backing down impossible without losing face in front of his team. He stripped off his gloves with sharp, violent motions, the latex snapping against his skin as he crossed the room toward Jade, with strides that felt aggressive despite their measured pace. "Show me," he said, and the two words contained volumes: skepticism, impatience, the absolute certainty that Jade was wasting his time with either incompetence or hysteria, that this would be revealed as a non-issue and he would be vindicated in his dismissal. Jade handed him the chart, pointing to the specific line, watching his face as he scanned the page, seeing the exact moment when his eyes found the notation, when reality punctured his confidence and left him scrambling to reframe the situation in a way that didn't make him look negligent. His face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, calculation, each one flickering across his features so quickly that anyone not watching closely might have missed them. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted register, no longer dismissive, but now defensive, edged with something that sounded almost like accusation. "This notation isn't properly flagged in our system. It should have been highlighted during the pre-operative checklist. Who did the intake for this patient?" The question hung in the air, and Jade understood immediately what was happening. Ellery was already constructing a narrative in which the problem wasn't his failure to read the chart carefully, but someone else's failure to make the information impossible to miss. Patricia Huang stepped forward, her movements careful and deliberate, and Jade could see the anesthesiologist calculating the politics of the moment, deciding how to navigate between supporting a colleague and protecting a patient. "The handwriting does look like it was added later," Patricia said, her voice neutral but thoughtful. "It's not in the same ink as the rest of the allergy section. Marcus, we should definitely verify this before proceeding. If she's allergic to cefazolin, we need to switch to an alternative prophylactic, and we need to make sure there are no other late additions to the chart that we've missed." Her intervention was masterful, supporting Jade's concern while also subtly validating Ellery's wounded pride by implying that the real problem was administrative rather than his own oversight. Kevin Torres nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a path forward that didn't require him to take sides, his young face showing the strain of witnessing a power struggle that nursing school and medical school never adequately prepared people for. Denise Crawford made a small sound of agreement, her decades of experience allowing her to cut through hierarchical nonsense when patient safety was at stake. Her presence at Jade's shoulder feeling like reinforcement that gave Jade permission to keep breathing. The room's atmosphere shifted slightly, the initial hostility giving way to something more complex. Professional assessment mixed with lingering resentment. The grudging acknowledgement that Jade had been right, mixed with anger that she'd been right in a way that embarrassed the surgeon. Doctor, Ellery handed the chart back to Jade with a gesture that managed to convey both dismissal and concession, his face settling into a mask of professional composure that didn't quite hide the irritation simmering underneath. Fine. We'll delay the procedure for 20 minutes while we verify all the allergy information with the patient's primary care physician and confirm an alternative antibiotic protocol. Nurse Moreno, I expect you to assist Dr. Huang in obtaining that confirmation and updating the surgical plan accordingly. The words were clipped, efficient, stripped of the warmth that might have indicated genuine gratitude, instead carrying the tone of someone issuing orders to reassert control after a momentary lapse. Jade nodded, accepting the assignment even as she recognized it for what it was, a way to make her responsible for the delay, to shift the narrative so that she became the cause of inconvenience rather than the person who'd prevented disaster. She watched Ellery turn away, saw him gesture to Kevin Torres to follow him out of the operating room, presumably to regroup and perhaps to vent his frustration away from witnesses, and she felt a complex mixture of relief and dread settle into her stomach. Relief because Carol Westfield would not receive a medication that could trigger anaphylactic shock. Dread because Jade understood that she'd just made an enemy of one of Chicago Memorial's star surgeons, that she'd challenged his authority in a way that he would neither forget nor forgive. The fluorescent lights continued their relentless humming. The antiseptic smell seemed sharper now, almost acrid, and Jade realized her hands were trembling again, not from fear this time, but from the adrenaline crash that followed, standing your ground when every instinct screamed at you to stay small and quiet. Patricia Huang touched Jade's elbow, a brief gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes in its brevity. "You did the right thing," the anesthesiologist said quietly. Her voice pitched low enough that only Jade could hear. "But you know he's going to make you pay for it, right? Ellery doesn't forgive being contradicted, especially not by junior staff, especially not when he's wrong." The words weren't cruel, just honest. The kind of brutal truth that experienced medical professionals shared with newcomers when they'd witnessed something that would have consequences. Jade nodded, swallowing against the tightness in her throat, because she'd already understood that truth on some level, had felt it in the way Ellery's eyes had hardened when he'd confirmed the allergy, in the way he'd reframed the situation to protect his own reputation at the expense of acknowledging her competence. She looked down at Carol Westfield, whose sedated form remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding around her. And Jade made a silent promise to this unconscious woman that she would see this through, that she would verify every detail and ensure that the surgery proceeded safely, regardless of what political consequences awaited her afterward. The operating room felt different now, charged with an energy that was part triumph and part foreboding, as if the space itself understood that something had shifted, that the normal hierarchy had been challenged and would now reassert itself with particular viciousness. Jade straightened her shoulders, picked up the chart, and moved toward the phone to begin the verification process, knowing that she'd crossed a line that morning that she could never uncross, that she'd chosen patient safety over career safety, and that the real test of her courage was only just beginning. Letter 3. The collapse on the table, The verification process took 47 minutes instead of the promised 20, a bureaucratic nightmare of phone calls and confirmations that left everyone in Operating Room 7 tense and irritable as the surgical schedule backed up and other procedures faced delays. Jade had spoken with Carol Westfield's primary care physician, Dr. Ramon Silva, who'd confirmed the cefazolin allergy with weary frustration, explaining that he'd called the hospital specifically 3 days earlier to flag it after Carol mentioned it during a pre-operative consultation, and that someone had assured him it would be prominently noted in the surgical chart. The revelation that the information had been recorded but not properly highlighted sent a chill through Jade's system because it suggested either systematic negligence or something more deliberate, though she couldn't imagine why anyone would intentionally obscure critical medical information. Patricia Huang had coordinated an alternative antibiotic protocol using clindamycin, adjusting her anesthesia plan accordingly, her movements efficient despite the obvious frustration radiating from her in waves. Dr. Ellery had returned to the operating room with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes, his professional mask firmly in place, but his body language screaming resentment with every gesture. Kevin Torres looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, caught between his need to learn from observing the surgery and his desire to be anywhere else on Earth, when the tension between Ellery and Jade was so thick it felt like a physical presence. Denise Crawford had maintained her usual unflappable demeanor, recounting instruments and preparing the surgical field with the kind of focused professionalism that came from decades of refusing to get sucked into interpersonal drama when there was work to be done. Carol Westfield had been fully anesthetized by the time the surgery finally began, her consciousness suppressed to the point where her body became a machine that Patricia Huang operated through careful administration of drugs and gases, monitoring vital signs with the vigilance of someone who understood that the line between medical intervention and medical disaster was often terrifyingly thin. The laparoscopic equipment hummed to life, screens flickering to display the interior geography of Carol's abdomen in grainy real-time video that transformed flesh into landscape, organs into territories to be navigated. Dr. Ellery made his initial incisions with practiced precision, his hands steady, despite the emotional turbulence Jade could sense radiating from him in subtle vibrations. His voice clipped as he called for instruments and issued instructions to Kevin Torres about proper technique and angle of approach. Jade moved through her assigned tasks with automatic efficiency, passing instruments, monitoring the equipment, her eyes constantly flicking between Carol's face and the monitors that displayed vital signs. That unease she'd felt earlier, refusing to dissipate despite the allergy issue having been addressed. Something still felt wrong, a wrongness she couldn't articulate, but that made her hyper-aware of every sound, every change in the room's atmosphere, her nervous system on high alert for threats she couldn't yet name. The surgery proceeded through its expected stages: identification of the gallbladder, careful dissection of surrounding tissue, the delicate work of separating an organ from the network of blood vessels and ducts that connected it to the rest of the body's infrastructure. 23 minutes into the procedure, Carol's blood pressure dropped. It wasn't a dramatic plunge, not initially, just a gradual decline that made Patricia Huang's eyebrows draw together in concentration, her hands moving to adjust medication dosages, compensating for what she initially assumed was a normal physiological response to the surgery. But the pressure continued dropping, steady and relentless, and Jade watched the numbers on the monitor decrease with mounting horror, her heart rate accelerating in inverse proportion to Carol's declining vitals. Patricia's voice sharpened, losing its earlier calm as she called out the numbers, and suddenly the operating room transformed from a space of controlled intervention to one of barely managed crisis. Carol's oxygen saturation began falling, her body not responding to Patricia's adjustments the way it should, and Dr. Ellery barked orders to pause the procedure to assess what was happening, his earlier arrogance evaporating as medical reality asserted itself with brutal efficiency. Kevin Torres froze, his inexperience showing in his wide eyes and immobile hands, and Jade found herself moving on instinct, anticipating needs before they were voiced, her training kicking in with automatic precision that bypassed conscious thought. The monitors began emitting warning tones, a cacophony of electronic alarm that turned the operating room into an auditory nightmare, each sound representing another system failing, another threshold crossed into dangerous territory. Jade's mind was racing, cycling through possibilities, trying to understand what could cause this kind of cascade in a routine surgery where the major allergy concern had been addressed. She looked at the chart again, that compulsion to verify returning with renewed intensity, her eyes scanning through the pages with desperate focus, while her hands continued performing her assigned tasks with muscle memory that freed her conscious mind for problem-solving. Something about the timing bothered her. The way Carol's decline had started not immediately after anesthesia, but after they'd begun the actual surgical intervention. As if the trigger wasn't the medications, but something else, something about the procedure itself or the preparation that had preceded it. Patricia was calling for emergency drugs now, her voice tight with controlled panic as she worked to stabilize Carol's blood pressure and oxygen levels. Her expertise, the only thing standing between this patient and catastrophic organ failure or cardiac arrest. Dr. Ellery had stepped back from the table, his hands held up in that universal gesture of sterile suspension, and for the first time since Jade had known him, he looked uncertain, his confidence cracked to reveal the human vulnerability underneath, the terrifying knowledge that even the best surgeon was sometimes helpless when a body decided to rebel. Denise Crawford was moving rapidly, fetching additional equipment, her movements economical and precise, even as her face showed the strain of witnessing a routine procedure spiral toward potential tragedy. Then Jade saw it, her eyes landing on a detail in the chart that made her stomach drop like an elevator with cut cables, a sensation of freefall that left her momentarily breathless. There was another notation, added in different handwriting than the allergy information, a line that indicated Carol had received a preoperative injection at 6:30 that morning, but the medication listed made no sense in the context of gallbladder surgery. Wasn't part of any standard protocol Jade had ever encountered. She grabbed Patricia Huang's arm, perhaps more forcefully than was appropriate, but with urgency that brooked no hesitation. "Dr. Huang, what's verapamil? There's a notation here that Carol received it this morning before surgery, but I don't understand why that would be administered for cholecystectomy." Patricia's head whipped around, her eyes widening as she processed Jade's question, and suddenly her hands were flying across her anesthesia cart, pulling up drug interaction databases on the small computer terminal mounted there. The color drained from Patricia's face as she read whatever appeared on the screen, and when she spoke, her voice was ice and fury combined. Verapamil is a calcium channel blocker. It's used for cardiac conditions, and it should never have been given to this patient before surgery because it potentiates the effects of certain anesthetic agents and can cause exactly this kind of cardiovascular collapse. Who authorized that injection? Who administered it? The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Jade felt the room's energy shift again, transforming from medical emergency to criminal investigation in the space between heartbeats. Dr. Ellery was suddenly looking at the chart over Jade's shoulder, his proximity making her skin crawl, even as she maintained her focus on the medical crisis unfolding. She could feel his breath on her neck as he read the notation, could sense the gears turning in his mind as he processed this new information and its implications. His hand reached past her to point at the notation, and his voice when he spoke was carefully controlled, the tone of someone trying to contain a rage that threatened to explode outward and incinerate everyone in its path. That's not my handwriting. That's not Dr. Huang's writing. Jade. Whose signature is that at the bottom of this order? She peered at the scrawled name, struggling to decipher the hurried cursive, and when she finally made out the letters, her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The signature belonged to Dr. Richard Chen, the chief of surgery, Marcus Ellery's direct supervisor, and the man who controlled surgical assignments and career advancement for every surgeon in the department. The name hung between them like a grenade, with the pin already pulled, and Jade understood in that crystalline moment that she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than a simple medical error. That the chart Carol Westfield carried contained evidence of something deliberate, something that connected to hospital politics and power struggles she'd been too junior to even notice until this moment. Patricia Huang was already administering counteragents, working frantically to reverse the verapamil's effects and stabilize Carol's cardiovascular system, her hands steady, even as her voice shook with the effort of maintaining professional composure. Around them, the operating room had become a war zone, where seconds mattered and every decision carried the weight of a life hanging in the balance. And Jade realized with sickening clarity that her voice hadn't just saved Carol Westfield from an allergic reaction. It had exposed a rot in Chicago Memorial Hospital that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. Chapter 4. The chart that exposed everything Carol Westfield survived. Though the surgery had to be aborted halfway through when her vitals finally stabilized enough to make continuing the procedure more dangerous than leaving the gallbladder in place and scheduling a future intervention after her body recovered from whatever cocktail of medications had nearly killed her. The recovery room became a fortress of monitoring equipment, with Patricia Huang personally overseeing Carol's emergence from anesthesia as if her vigilance alone could prevent any further complications from manifesting. Jade had remained at Carol's bedside for 3 hours, past the end of her shift, unable to leave, driven by a compulsion to see this through, to witness the moment when Carol's eyes opened and Jade could confirm that her intervention had actually saved a life rather than merely delaying an inevitable tragedy. When Carol finally regained consciousness, confused and in pain, but fundamentally alive, Jade felt something break open inside her chest, a release of tension that left her shaking so violently that a recovery nurse who didn't know the full story asked if she needed to sit down. The chart that had started everything sat in Dr. Ellery's hands now, sealed in a plastic evidence bag, as if it were a weapon recovered from a crime scene, which in some profound sense it was. Hospital administration had been notified, security had been called, and somewhere in the building's upper floors, meetings were happening behind closed doors that would determine whether Jade Moreno's career would be destroyed as collateral damage in whatever war she'd accidentally exposed. Dr. Richard Chen arrived in the recovery area 90 minutes after Carol stabilized. His face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was 58, silver-haired, and distinguished in the way that senior physicians cultivated, his white coat pristine, and his manner suggesting someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of appearing compassionate while actually being ruthless. He asked to speak with Jade privately, and when she followed him to a small consultation room, she felt like she was walking into an ambush, every instinct screaming danger, even though Chen's expression remained neutral, almost kind. He closed the door with a gentle click that somehow sounded ominous, and when he turned to face her, his smile was warm, but his eyes were cold, assessing, measuring her for weaknesses the way a predator sized up prey. "Nurse Moreno," he began, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "I want to personally thank you for your vigilance today. Your attention to detail potentially saved a patient's life, and that kind of nursing is exactly what makes Chicago Memorial an excellent institution. The compliment felt like a trap, too effusive, too calculated, and Jade found herself nodding mechanically while her mind raced to anticipate where this conversation was actually headed. Chen moved closer, not quite invading her personal space, but close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably cost more than her monthly rent, and his hand came to rest on her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to feel paternal, but instead made her skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. However, Chen continued, and there it was, the pivot she'd been expecting. I need you to understand that what happened today was a complex situation with multiple contributing factors, and jumping to conclusions about whose fault it was would be premature and potentially damaging to the hospital's reputation and to innocent individuals' careers. His hand squeezed her shoulder slightly, the pressure gentle but unmistakably a warning, and Jade felt her spine stiffen in response, her body rejecting the implied threat, even as her mind struggled to process what was being communicated. Chen's voice dropped lower, confidential, the tone of someone sharing insider information that should make the listener feel privileged to be included in such sensitive discussions. The signature on that medication order, my signature, was forged. We're conducting an internal investigation to determine who had access to the medication dispensary that morning and who might have had motivation to sabotage a routine surgery. But these investigations take time, Jade, and in the meantime, I need to know that you understand the importance of discretion. The media would have a field day with this story if it leaked prematurely, before we have all the facts, and that kind of publicity could destroy Chicago Memorial's reputation and cost hundreds of people their jobs, including yours. The threat wasn't even subtle anymore, just barely wrapped in the language of professional concern, and Jade felt anger beginning to burn through her fear, a slow-building fury that started in her gut and spread outward like wildfire consuming dry brush. She stepped back from Chen's touch, deliberately breaking the physical contact, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than she'd expected, clear and unflinching, despite the terror coiling in her chest. Dr. Chen, with respect, I'm not interested in participating in a cover-up. A patient nearly died today because someone, forged signature or not, administered a contraindicated medication and then failed to properly flag critical allergy information in her chart. If your signature was forged, then whoever did it needs to be held accountable. But that doesn't change the fact that our systems failed spectacularly. And if I hadn't happened to read that chart carefully, Carol Westfield would be dead right now. So no, I won't be staying quiet about this. I'll cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation. But I won't pretend this didn't happen. And I won't let you make me complicit in protecting whoever is responsible. The words felt like throwing gasoline on a fire, like choosing nuclear war over capitulation, and Jade watched Chen's face transform from false warmth to genuine coldness, the mask slipping to reveal the ruthlessness underneath. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and when he spoke again, the pretense of kindness had evaporated completely, leaving only the raw exercise of institutional power. You're making a very unwise decision, Nurse Moreno. You've been at this hospital for 2 years, which means you're still in a probationary classification, and I have significant influence over which nurses are retained and which are let go during staff evaluations. I'm giving you an opportunity to be smart about this, to understand how the world actually works, but if you insist on being naively idealistic, you'll find that idealism doesn't pay student loans or prevent professional blacklisting. The threat was naked now, stripped of all diplomatic language, and Jade felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity born from understanding that she'd already crossed the point of no return. that there was no version of this story where she stayed quiet and also remained the person she wanted to be. She thought about Carol Westfield lying in the recovery room, about how close that woman had come to death because people in authority had valued convenience and reputation over basic medical competence, and she felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. "Then I guess you should start the paperwork to terminate me," Jade said quietly, and she was surprised to find that her hands weren't shaking anymore, that fear had been burned away by something purer and more sustaining, righteous fury tempered with purpose. "Because I'm going to document everything that happened today, I'm going to provide my account to hospital administration and to whatever regulatory bodies need to be involved. And if that costs me my job, then maybe I don't want to work at an institution where telling the truth is grounds for termination." She moved toward the door, feeling Chen's eyes boring into her back, feeling the weight of the powerful enemy she'd just made, but also feeling something like freedom, the liberation that came from choosing integrity even when it was expensive. Her hand was on the doorknob when Chen spoke again, his voice stripped of pretense, raw with the kind of venom that only the powerful exhibited when confronted with someone they couldn't control. "You have no idea what you've just done to yourself. By this time tomorrow, every hospital in Chicago will know you as the nurse who accused a chief of surgery of attempted murder, and you'll be lucky if you can get a job changing bedpans at a nursing home." Jade paused, turned back to look at Chen one last time, and found that she could meet his glare without flinching, that she'd discovered some reservoir of courage she hadn't known she possessed until circumstances demanded it. "Maybe," she said, her voice calm despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "But I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror, which is more than you'll be able to say if you let whoever did this get away with it just to protect the hospital's reputation." She opened the door and walked out, her legs somehow supporting her, despite feeling like they were made of water, and she made it halfway down the hallway before the adrenaline crash hit and she had to lean against the wall, breathing deeply, trying not to vomit from the combination of terror and exhilaration that was making her entire body shake. She could hear Chen's footsteps receding in the opposite direction, could picture him already on his phone making calls to contain this situation, to spin the narrative in whatever way would minimize damage to himself and the institution. Around her, the hospital continued its relentless rhythms. Nurses responding to call lights, orderlies transporting patients, monitors beeping their electronic symphonies of measured vital signs. Everything looked normal, mundane, the everyday machinery of medical care grinding forward. But Jade knew that beneath that surface normalcy, something had ruptured, that her decision to speak up had torn open a wound that wouldn't be easily closed. Patricia Huang found her there 10 minutes later, still leaning against the wall, still trying to steady her breathing and process what had just happened. The anesthesiologist didn't say anything at first, just stood beside Jade in companionable silence. Another woman who'd spent her career navigating the treacherous waters of being competent and female in a male-dominated hierarchy. Finally, Patricia spoke, her voice quiet but firm, carrying the weight of experience and hard-won wisdom. "I documented everything in my anesthesia records, including the verapamil notation and the timeline of Carol's cardiovascular collapse. I've also filed a formal incident report with patient safety, with copies to the medical board and the hospital's quality assurance committee. Whatever happens next, you won't be alone in this, Jade. What you did today, both catching the allergy and refusing to be silenced, that took more courage than most people will show in their entire careers. Chen is going to come after you, and it's going to be ugly. But there are people in this hospital who believe that patient safety matters more than institutional politics, and we're going to make sure this gets investigated properly." The words were a lifeline, a reminder that she hadn't imagined the danger, that her concerns were valid, that speaking up had been right, even if it was costly. Jade felt tears finally spilling over, hot tracks down her cheeks that she didn't bother wiping away, and she turned to Patricia with a smile that was part gratitude and part exhausted relief. "Thank you," she whispered. And those two words contained multitudes. Gratitude for the support, acknowledgement of the risk Patricia was taking by standing with her, recognition that they were now bound together in whatever consequences followed. The investigation that followed would reveal that Dr. Richard Chen had been systematically sabotaging surgical procedures for junior surgeons he viewed as threats to his authority, using medication tampering and chart manipulation to create complications that made his rivals look incompetent, while positioning himself as the steady hand who always swept in to fix their mistakes. The forged signature had been Chen's own, a sloppy piece of tradecraft that he'd gotten away with because no one had thought to question the chief of surgery's orders. And Carol Westfield had been the 7th patient in 18 months to experience unexplained surgical complications that could be traced back to Chen's interference. The scandal would rock Chicago Memorial to its foundations, would result in Chen's termination, and criminal prosecution would lead to a complete overhaul of surgical protocols and chart management systems. But in that moment, leaning against the wall with Patricia Huang beside her, Jade knew none of that future vindication. She only knew that she'd chosen truth over safety, that she'd risked everything to protect a patient she'd never met before that morning, and that somewhere in the recovery room, Carol Westfield was breathing steadily, alive because a 24-year-old nurse had trusted her instincts and found her voice even when the entire weight of institutional authority was pressuring her to stay silent. The fluorescent lights continued their eternal humming overhead. The antiseptic smell still permeated everything, but Jade felt fundamentally different than she had when she'd walked into Operating Room 7 that morning. She'd been tested in ways she couldn't have anticipated, had discovered reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed, and had learned the hard truth that doing the right thing often meant standing alone against people who had every advantage except honesty. As she finally pushed off from the wall and headed toward the locker room to change out of her scrubs, Jade Moreno understood that she'd crossed a threshold, that she'd become the kind of nurse, the kind of person who would always choose difficult truth over comfortable silence, and that this choice would define every decision she made for the rest of her career, every interaction with authority, every moment when she had to decide whether to speak or stay quiet. The young nurse had warned the surgeon, and in doing so had exposed a corruption that had festered in the darkness for too long, had saved not just one life, but potentially dozens more, and had proven that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one that everyone wants to ignore.